But if people want to say we mishandled the Epstein release, guilty. We did mishandle, especially the communications of it.
If Democrats were smart, they would clip this and run it to the midterms.
What do you think should have been done?
I think that we should have just dropped everything at the very beginning. And like, obviously it takes a little time to review the stuff, to find the stuff, to redact things where you have victims and so forth. But we should have just done it as quickly as possible.
But some of the stuff that was redacted, some of the names that were redacted weren't victims.
So yeah, I've looked into this.
JD Vance apparently gearing up for 2028 does what every candidate running for office does. Goes on Joe Rogan and tries to make their case. Unfortunately for Vance, fortunately for us, he's really bad at it.
My understanding of this, having looked at a lot of this, but not all of it, is that it is sometimes hard to draw a distinction between victim and co-conspirator. And like, let me highlight this in a very sort of obvious way. Ro Khanna, who's been one of the loudest voices on the Epstein file. Well, he became very loud on the Epstein files the minute Donald Trump became president, didn't seem to care about it during the Biden administration. He actually brought one of the Epstein victims, I think, to the State of the Union last year, or maybe it was the year before last. Well, like that victim, and I'm not saying she wasn't a victim. I don't know anything about her particular case. She was also listed as a co-conspirator in some of these documents, right? So there's an idea that some of the people who were engaged in the sex trafficking were also, facilitating it as well.
So they were incentivized to get more girls.
Yeah, but yes, that's right. But the idea is that it's hard to sort of, it's sometimes a little bit of a gray area between, some of the people who were alleged victims were also alleged co-conspirators. And so what DOJ tried to do was kind of make that judgment as best they could and release as much as possible.
JD Vance is asked by Joe Rogan whether or not there could be compromising information in the Epstein files that's basically swaying whether or not Trump went to war with Iran, whether or not he's being blackmailed, so to speak. And JD Vance's answer is that he's seen how Trump operates. Well, we have also seen how Trump operates. And basically, he's a dysfunctional mess. One day we're in peace deals. The next day we're bombing them. The next one we're friends with them. And he thinks that we need to actually invest in business with Iran. And then he's trying to annihilate their civilization. That seems to me the exact opposite of somebody taking some sort of reasoned approach. But that's JD Vance's answer. Not no, there's nothing in those files that could be compromising or have any influence over the literal president of the United States and whether or not he goes to war. No, the answer is that somehow Trump's way of decision-making makes it so obvious that he's not compromised. Sorry if I don't take JD Vance's word for it.
Pam Bondi said, the client list is on my desk, right?
Well, they had binders. They were standing in front.
But those binders were largely documents that had already been released, right? So let me try to
what was the
defend.
purpose of that performative display of the Epstein files?
JD Vance apparently thinks that he's taking accountability for the fact that they still haven't released the Epstein files despite a congressional act requiring them to do so by saying that they messed up the comms. Okay, so comms are basically communication. He's saying that not that they messed up by, first of all, announcing a year ago that there was no evidence of co-conspirators and that the case was closed, to actually then releasing files that was very implicating for many men, including Prince Andrew, who had his literal royal title stripped from him because of the evidence that was released. No, it wasn't because they didn't release the files. He's not saying that was what they did wrong. He's just saying they didn't communicate well about it. Their communication was off. JD Vance, talk about the most disparaging, disturbing, the gaslighting to victims. That in this moment when he's talking about Joe Rogan, and he's apparently trying to come across as this everyman person who realizes that they've done something wrong, of course, because even among MAGA. MAGA's pretty upset that they haven't released the Epstein files. This was something that was important to them. So he's coming across as if he's trying to understand the people, understand the anger. And his way of owning it is, we should have communicated better. Not only that, but then he tries to justify why all of the files haven't been released yet. Again, we're talking about months after the Epstein Transparency Act was released. He says the reason why is because some of the women who at the time were girls or had perhaps turned 18 were victims as well as possible co-conspirators. As we know, Virginia Giuffre wrote in her book, Nobody's Girl, that was something that Maxwell and Epstein did. They basically enlisted some of the girls who had been trafficked by Maxwell and Epstein for a longer period of time to help them target and enlist other girls. So the victims could possibly also become co-conspirators. So he says the reason why there were so many redactions was because they were trying to somehow not release the names of these victims who could also be co-conspirators. Like as if there are no male co-conspirators, because there was no male that Epstein trafficked and then enlisted to help target other girls. It was literally only females. So his answer makes zero sense. Again, because since the release of the files, we have seen men identified, and men like Prince Andrew literally have to take consequences as a result of the evidence in those files about what happened with him and Virginia Giuffre.
New Mexico Attorney General Torres, he is currently in a standoff with the Department of Justice over its failure to release unredacted versions of the Epstein files the Attorney General is seeking in a matter very much a part of the New Mexico story with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Mr. Attorney General, I'm glad to have you here. I want to play another soundbite from Danielle Bensky about what the release of the Epstein files in an unredacted way did to her and other victims by releasing information that made them more vulnerable than they already were. Please listen.
Todd Blanche has been at the helm of the release of nude images of survivors, the outing of Jane Does, and the exposure of more than 100 victims identifying information and documents describing horrific acts of abuse, including my own. Instead of treating this release as its own violation and holding the man who led it accountable, you have a decision on whether you place him in the highest law enforcement position in this country.
Mr. Attorney General, when the Department of Justice put out a statement today saying they would try to have a meeting between Todd Blanche and survivors, it said this: "And we have always encouraged any victim with new evidence of a crime to speak with the FBI." Mr. Attorney General, I'm not an expert, but that seems to put the burden on survivors and victims, not on the investigatory apparatus of the federal government.
And let's not forget that they are still refusing to release the files. As J.D. Vance is talking to Joe Rogan, the New Mexico Attorney General issued a public letter asking the DOJ to help them with this active criminal investigation they have into Zorro Ranch. An active criminal investigation. They say that they have reached out to the Department of Justice multiple times over the past few months and haven't gotten any of the materials. Well, the New Mexico Attorney General just said that they heard from the Department of Justice that they will not cooperate. Stunning. The Department of Justice not willing to cooperate with an active criminal investigation by the New Mexico Attorney General. The New Mexico Attorney General wrote that without that cooperation, their criminal investigation would have irreparable harm. And yet the Department of Justice still says they will not participate. They will not send New Mexico the unredacted material. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance is on Joe Rogan saying that their problem, what they did, was just not communicate as well, despite the fact that they could even now still cooperate. That he says nothing about.
you and I have talked about this a lot. I'm like one of the OG Epstein conspiracy theorists. I've probably gone down every single rabbit hole we could go down, most of them today.
Well, most people think he was Mossad.
Yeah, Mossad or CIA or some other deep state, whether in America or Israel or another country, or both. Look, he clearly had connections to the highest levels of American intelligence. He clearly had connections to the highest levels of Israeli intelligence.
And then JD Vance just casually says that, yeah, most likely Epstein is both connected to the CIA and Mossad with nothing to back it up. He's not a casual podcaster. He's literally the sitting vice president. And if that's the case, if he knows this based on his position and his access to information, certainly his own Department of Justice and the FBI should be doing a whole heck of a lot more about this.
New Meidas merch. Head to store.MeidasTouch.com today and get yourself the best pro-democracy gear and show your support. That's store.MeidasTouch.com.